What is silver divorce? Silver divorce refers to the split or separation of older couples who have been married for a long time. It's also called silver or diamond splitters, and the term refers to the hair color that older people often have. The term began as far back as 2004, and the practice has been pretty prevalent for the last couple of decades. But research shows the overall rate of divorce in the United States has declined for much of the past 20 years until the pandemic, but the divorce rate of people over 50 is on the rise. And today, we're going to talk about why and what to do about it.
Welcome to the Starting Over Stronger show, where you'll find help and hope for your divorce survival and recovery. Divorce well, live well.
Hello, and welcome back to the Starting Over Stronger Divorce Survival and Recovery show. I am here today to talk with you about something you may or may not have heard of. If you have, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. If not, you will soon. It's silver divorce, and that refers to people that are getting divorced in their senior years. So welcome to the show, Russ Thornton. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Annie. Thanks for inviting me to join you.
Yeah. So Russ Thornton is a financial advisor. He'll talk to you a little bit more about that. His company is Wealth Care for Women, and he has a podcast called Women's Retirement Radio. So if you fit into this silver divorce category, I'm going to assume those are some things you might want to check out. So tell us a little bit more about both.
Yeah, so I'm a financial advisor. I've been doing this for 28 years. I'm based in the Atlanta, Georgia area, but I've got clients scattered all over the country, most of whom are here local to me, but I've got some scattered, from coast to coast. I would say about 6 or 8 years ago, Annie, I deliberately decided to focus on serving women, and more specifically women in their 50s and 60s. Mm-hmm. And just, I think, through the natural course of working with, talking to, networking with both those women as well as the professionals that serve them, I find myself working with or getting introduced to more and more women that are dealing with divorce. They're either in the midst of it or they're, the settlement papers have just been signed and they're like, what do I do now? And so clearly there are some financial components involved there. So we spend a lot of time kind of getting organized and putting a plan of action in place there so they can make smart decisions for the future. But we also spend a lot of time on non-financial matters like lifestyle and their values and things that are important to them and how they want to use their financial resources to make the most of the years they've got left. So it's super interesting. Very rewarding, very challenging, but interesting work. So I'm blessed to be in a position to do what I love and love what I do.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing it. There's a lot of need out there, so I'm excited about getting into this topic with you and really helping people in this category to understand what the unique challenges are that they face and how they can overcome those. So let's just start with defining silver divorce. I don't know if there's a Webster dictionary definition of it, but how would you define it?
I've heard it described as gray divorce or silver divorce. I've heard it basically for anyone that's 50 plus. I've also heard it for anyone that's 60 plus. I think I've heard of golden divorce, which is for 75 plus. Okay. So I'm not sure where all of the ages and descriptors fall in, but in my mind, I kind of generally think of it as anyone that's, 50s plus, kind of later in life divorce, I think kind of falls under the umbrella of silver or gray divorce in this context.
Right. And something that you said earlier that I caught on to was that you found that you began to deal more and more with people in this category. And in the latest statistics that I've read, this is the fastest growing age category in divorce. And so it's no wonder that you're seeing more of it. And I think we're going to get into that a little bit later as to why we might speculate on that. But how would you say that you became an expert on silver divorce?
I think it's a couple of a couple of things that I bring to the table. So I'm a former certified divorce financial analyst. So I went through the training to get that designation, and that came with a lot of background and context around both the financial and the legal aspects of divorce. And then just the 28 years of experience I have working with women, couples, families, some of whom have spouses passed away, and I continue to work with the widow, or I've seen couples go through divorce. And then to kind of color all of that, when I was coming out of college, this has been ages ago now, but my mom and dad went through a divorce. And the short version of a long story is my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She raised my two younger brothers and I. I was out of the house at this point. My dad had been very, very successful. And so the punchline is she got a lot of assets, a lot of spousal support, a lot of child support for my two younger brothers. And through a series of some less than ideal decisions on her part, as well as the lack of any good financial advice she received along the way, today she's in her mid 70s and has had to declare bankruptcy. She gets Social Security and a little bit of a pension that she got from my dad. And that's kind of where she is today. And so I've seen what could have been a very different, arguably a much more positive outcome kind of go off the rails. And so kind of coupling that with my just natural affinity to serving and working with women, I think has really helped open my eyes to both some of the challenges as well as some of the opportunities that come with divorce late in life, and how to think about being a good steward of whatever financial resources you have coming out of divorce, especially if you're in your 50s and 60s and don't have, another 20 or 30 years of career ahead of you, or can't just jump back into the workforce, or, some of the other challenges that are present.
Yeah. Well, and certainly professional experience goes a long way, but personal experience, I think, is oftentimes what sells someone on working with us, because they want to know that you've in some way been personally affected by the exact issues that they are dealing with, because that's going to naturally give you a passion and just more information about how to handle those situations, either because you've seen the worst outcome or because you've experienced the best and you know how to get from one to the other. So thank you for sharing that. What would you say is your opinion, professional or otherwise, on why silver divorce is such a fastest growing age category for divorce?
I've got some amateur theories. I'm not sure how accurate they are, but I think I don't think there's any one thing. I think it's a combination of things.
I would agree.
I think I think part of it is people are living longer. They're going to be typically facing more years in retirement after the working years. And I find a lot of, not just women, but oftentimes women, they're so involved in raising the kids and things like that, that once the kids are up and out of the house, sometimes they lose some sense of their identity because they were so involved in raising the family and taking care of the family, not just the kids, but their spouse as well. Yeah. And when a husband, for example, has spent 30 plus 40 years, really driven in their career, where they, and I'm guilty of this, where they get a lot of their identity. And once that goes away, once they retire, you've got two people that maybe have, I don't want to say have grown apart, but they're just different people and at different stages of their lives. And sometimes they either one or both of them conclude that, do we want to spend the next 20 or 30 years of our lives together? And increasingly, we're seeing the answer is no. So I don't think it's I'm oversimplifying, but I think that's, life expectancy, and then just people investing so much of themselves and their identity into their roles in a relationship, whether that's raising a family or it could be two working spouses. It doesn't have to be a stay-at-home mom, but it can be two working spouses that once the careers go away and you've got all this discretionary time on your hands, you might realize that you don't want to continue spending it with the person you've been spending it with for the last, 30 plus years.
Right. Yeah, I would agree. And interestingly, you brought up identity, and that's actually going to be my next discussion on the show is about how identity changes through divorce. So thank you for making that great segue for the next episode of the show. But
Absolutely.
I would agree that living longer certainly contributes to it. I actually heard a joke that said, yes, it's definitely a contributing factor because before this, people just went ahead and stayed together and died together. Because there wasn't all that much time between when the kids were gone and we realized we weren't really in mesh or weren't really meshing well together, I guess is what I want to say. And when, we could expect to probably expire. So now anticipating that that's going to be 20 or 30 years, sometimes people make the decision that they don't want to spend those years with this person for whatever reason. So I would agree with that. I think another factor would be how many more women are working than was the case 20, 30, 40 years ago, and certainly even longer ago. But, when someone's in a double income situation, there's a little bit more freedom there for them to make that decision that they don't have to stay. And certainly when that has not been the case, there are unique challenges that person will face. That's not to say that they have to stay, but just that they're going to have to approach it a little bit differently and with more caution to make sure that their needs are met. So what would you say are some of the primary concerns for silver divorcees over what other people who are much younger might not have to deal with?
So we've kind of touched on one of them already, which is life expectancy. Not only are we all collectively living longer, but I think we're all familiar with the statistics that women generally live longer than their male counterparts.
True.
So women need to think about planning for a longer life expectancy and having the financial wherewithal to support themselves. But, at the same time, many of these women are, taking time away from the workforce to have children, raise a family, things like that. So, and then add to that the wage gap where, often women are earning, 80 cents on the dollar or less for comparable work that their male counterparts are getting in many roles and situations. So that's kind of this perfect storm where they've got to figure out how to do more and make the money last longer, even though they maybe have a shorter period of time or less comparable income to support that. Yeah. So that's kind of one. Two, we also find a lot of women in their 50s, 60s, and older are kind of falling into the sandwich generation, where they're falling. Falling is not the right word. Where they're taking responsibility for caring for aging parents, and many of them are also supporting either financially, physically, through housing or whatever, adult children. And whether it's both or one or the other, I mean that's a unique challenge in and of itself. And then the third and final point I would make, Annie, is that a lot of women who are super bright and super capable of managing finances themselves. A lot of them have been in long-term marriages where just through natural division of labor, they let their husband take care of a lot of the money decisions and, investments and financial planning and things like that. So while they're capable, they just don't have the familiarity with dealing with day-to-day finances and things like that. And so I think that makes them a little bit more anxious about it. And a lot of times that anxiety leads to just doing nothing, kind of sticking their head in the sand, which is obviously is not a good long-term solution. But I think you add all those ingredients together and you've got this recipe that can be really, really challenging for the average woman who's dealing with divorce later in her life.
And I would agree. And guilty as charged. I was that woman that just didn't do anything with any of the financial stuff until I had to. And then I figured it out. And thankfully I've gotten some good feedback that I did well for myself in applying what I did know about life and finances to being able to provide for myself and being able to, learn to budget and to plan for the future and all of those things. So I'm here to tell you, if that's you absolutely can learn it. Don't believe the lie that you can't. So
I could not agree with that more. It's there's more and more information out there. You can do this. So just if you take nothing else away from this, just know that you can do this.
Yeah. And just, a lot of it, I think, has to do with, the old saying that if you believe you can, you can. If you believe you can't, you can't. And there's more truth in that than most people realize, because our thoughts are very, very powerful. And I think most people that make that transition from I can't do any of this stuff to, I know how to handle all of this, just decide that they're going to. And literally, that really truly is what flips the switch and allows you to be able to. So definitely keep that in mind if that is you, ladies. So we're just going to touch now on some issues that I'm sure everyone in Silver Divorce deals with on some level. And the first of those is standard of living. And, there's kind of I don't know if I would call it a myth, but there's a belief that we should be able to go on having the same standard of living that we had when we were married, when we are divorced. I can't say that it's one way or the other. I've seen it go both ways, but I think there's, a conversation to be had here about that, because whether your lifestyle changes or it doesn't, I think what's important to take away when you think about standard of living is that either way, you can have a life that you can enjoy.
Are you struggling to decide whether divorce is the right decision for you, or just tired of feeling like you're broken and everything is all your fault? The decision of how and whether to leave a toxic relationship can take years without good support from people who understand. The Starting Over Stronger Toxic Relationship Recovery Support Group is designed with you in mind. Led by me, certified divorce and life transition coach Annie Allen, and with a small group of women in your shoes, you're going to find understanding here. We're going to talk about the patterns of these relationships and what you can do about them. There are currently 2 weekly groups running, one on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Central and the other on your Wednesday lunch hour at noon Central. So whether you need an evening or a daytime group to meet your needs for privacy during this call, please consider joining us. If you're interested in learning more, just send an email with your interest from your secure email address that only you have access to Annie@startingoverstronger.com. And if you're in a controlling or abusive relationship, wondering how you could ever be a part of a support group like this without putting yourself at risk or exposing your desire to leave, please indicate that in your email and we can discuss solutions. You can make this work. And I know you feel alone, but you're not. Reach out and find the help you need.
What are your thoughts on the changes that one faces in their standard of living as they go through a silver divorce?
Well, I agree. It's very situational. Everyone's, lifestyle and what they're accustomed to is going to be different from one person to the next. I would say on average or on balance, it's more expensive for two people to live individually than it is for them to live together. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that the average woman out there needs to plan to make some adjustments to her lifestyle and her standard of living. Mm-hmm. Now, how big those adjustments may need to be, I think is largely going to be based on your mindset and expectations. As you mentioned a minute ago, Annie, your mindset and your thoughts are super, super powerful, mm-hmm. and they can both work for or against you. Mm-hmm. So I think if you think that, your life is over and you're going to have to, live on cat food and, pinch pennies for the rest of your life, that's probably not the case. But neither is it the case that you can actually go out and just, continue the same lifestyle you've become accustomed to. Mm-hmm. So I like to frame it in terms of trade-offs. So if you've been, and I'm just going to make up some numbers, but if you've been living on $6,000 a month on average, and now you can only afford to live on $4,000 a month. Well, there's $2,000 a month less that you can spend. So do you take that equally out of every place you spend money, or do you make some priority-based decisions and say, well, these things I'm willing to negotiate on because maybe they're not as important to me or aren't as aligned with my values, whereas some of these other things are super important to me. And a lot of times that revolves around kids, family, self-care, things like that. But it's going to be dependent. So I would say on average, I think that you should be prepared for some changes to your lifestyle, hopefully relatively minor or moderate changes, but I think it can be dangerous just assuming that you can keep on spending and living like you have been once you're on your own.
Yeah, I agree. And one example that I give when I think about standard of living changes for people is just the house, because I am also a licensed real estate agent and I work with people on their real estate decisions as they go through divorce. I often talk about this because there seems to be a common, I'll call it a misconception that, especially if there are still children in the home, even if they are older, the desire to stay in that house, especially if you don't feel like the divorce is your fault, quote unquote, that you should be able to stay in the house, that the children should be able to stay in place. And, if there's a way to negotiate that as part of the settlement agreement, great. And maybe that's a short-term decision. Maybe it's a long-term decision. But more often than not, it makes more sense not to, because oftentimes that house that the couple shares, they could afford because they were either a two-income family or because the husband was a high earner. And that's not going to be the case now. And so, although certainly there's an emotional attachment to staying in the home, it oftentimes makes much more sense to downsize and even sometimes to rent for a while just to get on your feet and to know what your financial situation is going to look like. And that doesn't have to be a loss. I mean, certainly it is, because it's a change that you maybe didn't ask for, but it's not a loss when you can reframe it and think about it as a fresh start in a new place that you can create positive memories and make all your own. So I like to use that example because that kind of is true across the board, whether you're talking about a house or finances or kids or lifestyles. It's yes, there are going to be changes, and yes, we can look at those as negatives, or we can reframe them and say, actually, this is a fresh start for me. This is a new way of living for me, and I can make it what I want it to be.
Yeah, the marital home that's such a touchy subject. It's a great example, but as you mentioned, there's so much emotion tied up, and sometimes decades of raising a family and building memories and things like that. But I've seen situations too, and you've probably seen this too, Annie, in your work in real estate, where the wife negotiates and is awarded the marital home, but she doesn't have the income to support payments or just upkeep and things like that.
Yeah.
And alimony, at least here in Georgia, alimony or spousal support is not counted as income until you've received it for 6 months. And so you can't, even if you're getting a nice alimony check each month, you might have to wait 6 months before you can include that to get the house refinanced in your name. And so I've seen some really heartbreaking situations where the wife fought tooth and nail to get the marital home. Turns out she can't afford to keep it, and has to wind up downsizing when it's the last thing she wanted to do. And in some cases, she was willing to forego other assets or other financial resources to keep the marital home. So that can be almost a double whammy. So
yeah. Absolutely. That is a big part of the work that I do with people as an RCSD realtor, is just helping to inform that decision, because unfortunately, this is a gap in the legal world of divorce, both for attorneys and judges. They're being short-sighted on what is being awarded and decided in the marital settlement agreement with uninformed decisions like that, like what you just described. And furthermore, additional things like keeping a house that has debt in the form of liens attached to it that nobody even observes because they didn't do their homework to determine that they existed. And somebody keeps a house that they didn't realize there were liens on the property. And, suddenly those are your problem now. And so there's a lot of things that get missed in that process. So we could have a whole episode on that. But what we're talking about here is just, informing that decision for yourself and your standard of living, and knowing that changes may have to happen, changes that are very difficult for you to swallow. But ultimately, what we want you to know is that you're going to come away from this better and at more peace and more, in a more stable position if you don't make decisions based on trying to maintain a standard of living that isn't probably reasonable for you to obtain or attain during such a large transition as divorce, especially in the senior years. So I think we've said enough about that. Now talking about equitable distribution, what would you define that as, and what can we help people to understand about that?
So Georgia is an equitable distribution state, and I think most people misunderstand equitable to be equal, and it's not. It's what the courts or the mediator or whatever process you're applying to your divorce situation. It's whatever they deem as fair.
Yeah.
And fair is not always equal. It can, in fact, be quite different. And so that brings up a lot of gray areas about things like the marital home and who gets it and how do you value it. If there's a small business, if the husband or wife owns a small business, how do you value that? And small businesses typically aren't liquid. So if you want to get what you feel you're owed for part of that business, how does that work? And what's equitable? And so I would say that we could probably both give a lot of examples of the difference between equitable and what people think of as equal. But I would probably just put a bow on it by saying that equitable is not equal, and it is basically what is considered fair in the eyes of whoever is making decisions. So if you're going through mediation, you're negotiating that yourself. If your divorce goes before a judge, it's going to be up to the judge, and it can lead to some surprises, not so good surprises. So I think to the extent you can, if you can avoid going to court, settle things through mediation or through a collaborative divorce process, that would be my recommendation. Because anything you can do to more amicably divide and separate from your spouse, it's more likely that equitable and equal will be closer together than basically putting that decision in someone else's hands.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. And I would say, with most of what we're talking about here and what we're going to talk about, we're not necessarily going to answer everyone's questions about their specific situation. What is equitable? What's 50-50? What's fair? What's equal? Those words mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what we want to do is just give you kind of a bullet list of things that you really need to be thinking about and talking with somebody about to get these questions answered for yourself. And so equitable distribution is one of those. We've already kind of touched on this next one, which is alimony. And I think what goes along with alimony, also called maintenance in some states, is the fact that in silver divorce, there's certainly a lack of career potential that must be dealt with for a lot of people, especially those who have chosen to stay at home. So what are your thoughts on what types of things people need to be thinking about in regard to alimony, maintenance, and career potential?
Well, depending on where you live, the jurisdiction you're in, I think there are a lot of big misunderstandings about alimony. Speaking locally, like in the Atlanta metro area, alimony is increasingly becoming a less important part of divorce settlements, I've found, especially something that goes before a judge or goes to trial. And I've gotten some different explanations for why that is, but suffice it to say, like, if your expectation is you're in your 50s, 60s, going to get divorced, you've been out of the workforce, raising a family, you've been supporting your husband while he's been, grinding, 50, 60 hours a week at work, and you're owed some economic value from that. I don't disagree, but the expectation that you're going to get, 8, 10, 12, or 15 years of alimony or spousal support, just that, in my experience, that just doesn't happen anymore. Again, every situation is going to be a little bit different. Yeah. But in my experience, for someone that's been in a long-term marriage that's getting divorced later in life, I would say 5 to 6 to maybe 7 years of spousal support is increasingly rare, but that's probably what I see on the long end. And more often it's more considered by the local courts and jurisdictions as a transition, kind of a transition assistance. And it's more often like 2 or 3 years. So we could, like all these topics, Annie, we could probably spend a full hour just diving into the details of each. But I would say that don't assume that, and this goes back to earlier about changing standard of living and lifestyle. Just don't go in with the expectation or the assumption that you're going to have a big alimony check that's going to go on for the next 8 or 10 plus years, because in my experience that's becoming very rare.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of surprised to hear you say that. And I guess part of it for the shock of hearing it is that we're talking about silver divorce. So how is someone who's 55, 60, 65, how is it that they're expected to start a career at that age? Or is it just that the judges just don't care? You're going to have to figure it out.
So I've been told by more than one family law attorney here locally that a lot of it depends on who the judge is. But I've heard there are some female judges that have no sympathy for, a stay-at-home mom that's expecting a big financial settlement. And I've heard that, like I said, on more than one occasion. But wow. I think also the thinking is that, if a woman is in her late 50s, 60s, she can get Social Security as early as 62. She'll be Medicare eligible at 65. So I think, again, I'm kind of reading between the lines here, but I think a lot of these settlements or decisions are based on, can I transition this woman to Social Security, or can I transition her to Social Security and Medicare to, kind of almost treat alimony or spousal support as a bridge to get her to Social Security income or something like that.
Right.
But interesting, a lot of times Social Security is going to be, they're going to be dependent on the spousal benefit because they might not have enough working credits to, have a benefit that would be higher than spousal benefit. So there's a lot of moving parts there, but and I don't have a great answer, but that's a couple of explanations I've heard and seen firsthand.
Well, and like I said, we're not going to answer everybody's questions here today, but it's something that needs to certainly be on their mind to think about and to explore with someone, because that's a very real concern. I mean, it puts women in a situation where, maybe at a very late stage in life, she's realized, especially in a situation maybe where she's been in a toxic relationship with someone who's controlling or manipulative or deceitful, or, just any number of harmful scenarios for a woman to continue to subject herself to. She has a choice to either continue to live like that for the rest of her life, or it sounds like maybe to, just go to a position of really being very poor almost, and certainly if she comes from a high earning family situation, that's a hard pill to swallow right there. Which one am I going to choose? To be miserable the rest of my life, or to struggle financially for the rest of my life? And I am the idealist in me does not sit well with. That should not be a choice someone has to make.
I agree. It shouldn't, but I've seen many situations where it is. And to be clear, I think a lot of it is, clearly there are some situations where someone can go from living a very comfortable lifestyle in a marriage to going through divorce and being hopefully not destitute, but being in a very radically different financial position. But I think a lot of that goes hand in hand with your expectations of what's going to, and I think, your podcast is a great resource because people don't know what they don't know.
Right.
And so I think just talking with, you doing this podcast, talking with guests and giving people things to think about can hopefully help them educate themselves and make more informed decisions before they head down that path, whether they ultimately decide to get divorced or not. So I'm not saying that makes the situation any rosier than it is, but I think the more you can educate yourself and know what to expect and get a handle on your financial situation, there'll be less of a shock factor there, which I think can go a long way to help ease that transition.
For sure. And the next topic we're going to cover will hopefully be a little bit of a parachute, I'll say, for people in that very situation, and that is retirement. So perhaps if income is not going to be what it needs to be in these situations for silver divorcees, maybe there is a sizable retirement or other, asset division that could come in to save the day a little bit. And as part of that, the QDRO, the CDRO is the tool that is often used to determine how those assets are going to be divided. What thoughts do you have on that?
So retirement assets are particularly interesting when it comes to divorce. And a lot hinges on the age. So as some of your listeners may be aware, if you're 59 and a half or younger, and you try to get assets out of a retirement account. So that's an IRA, a 401k, a 403b. There's typically a penalty, plus you pay income taxes on anything you take out. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go through a divorce and you're under 59 and a half, you can take a one-time non-penalty free distribution from a retirement account. And you can actually do that in association with a QDRO, as you mentioned. But
Russ, is that a state-based law or is that nationwide?
That's federal. That's federal. Okay. Yeah. And so the QDRO, the QDRO stands for Qualified Domestic Relations Order, and that is appropriate for qualified retirement accounts. And when I say qualified, that's typically going to be a company-sponsored retirement account, like a 401k or a 403b, which a lot of teachers and hospital workers have access to and things like that. If you just have an IRA, you don't need a QDRO for an IRA. A QDRO is really for, typically going to be involved for company-sponsored retirement plans. But you need to be aware of like the timing, your age, because like if you get $1 awarded to you in a retirement plan and you're under 59 and a half versus $1 awarded to you in a non-retirement account, those aren't worth the same amount of dollars, at least today, because you have to pay taxes at a minimum, maybe even a penalty to access these retirement dollars. And so you might only get 65 cents on the dollar to actually utilize and spend those dollars versus, non-retirement dollars. So that goes back to your earlier comment, Annie, about just there needs to be a little bit more thoughtfulness given to the division of assets, even more specifically, like what are in different accounts. I could give you story after story where I've seen what on the surface looks like a pretty equitable division of assets, but then you dig into and you see some of the crap, for lack of a better word, that were in these investment or retirement accounts that were awarded to the wife, and the money's not even if she wanted to pay the penalty in taxes, she can't because they're illiquid investments. And so. Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox, but yeah, it's, there's a lot of moving parts there. I would say just be cognizant of retirement account assets. Be cognizant of if you need a QDRO, that's typically a different document that needs to be drafted outside of your settlement agreement. There's a cost for that. Oftentimes family law attorneys can do that, but just as often they'll refer that out to an attorney that specializes in drafting QDROs. So I'm actually working through one of those with a client right now. There's just a lot of moving parts. It's not something you need to hire a financial advisor with necessarily, but just be patient and ask questions along the way.
Yeah, I was just thinking, be very curious. Yes. Be very willing to learn, be very teachable. And, retirement is one thing. And then there are non-retirement assets that may be able to be structured in a way that they could create an income source. So that's something to keep in mind as well when you're going through that process. So.
Hey, this is Annie. I wanted to stop for just a moment and ask you what you're doing, besides listening to this podcast, to take care of yourself during your divorce. I mean, after all, if you don't, who will? There are several ways you can join Starting Over Stronger as you heal through divorce. First of all, very exciting news. We just launched the brand new startingoverstronger.com website. Come check it out and become a member so you can stay up to date on all the latest opportunities for support. If you haven't yet, you're also welcome to join our private Starting Over Stronger After Divorce group on Facebook. Denise recently joined there and shared that her divorce is a minute-by-minute struggle at times. And Gretchen also joined us recently as she faces a difficult separation situation and has all kinds of questions about what to do to protect herself. And of course, the more of you that join this group, the more answers you all can get from each other. And of course, I chip in there too. Now, the best spot for answers is in private or group coaching, where we can talk specifically about the exact issues that you're facing in a private format. So you'll also find out more about those on the new website. I watch for you to join both the new website platform and the Facebook group. Remember, the website is just startingoverstronger.com, but the private Facebook group is Starting Over Stronger After Divorce. And you will have to answer some questions there. And we make very sure that anybody that joins is someone that belongs.
So I hope to see you all there soon. I would love to meet more of my listeners and get to know each of you and the situations that you're facing. So I hope to see you there soon. Okay, so let's talk about beneficiaries. I read something when I was kind of researching this topic, and there was some talk about there being confusion for people in silver divorce with regard to beneficiaries. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, that's a broad concept, but have you seen that be an issue?
I've seen it. I don't know that I've seen it cause confusion, but I've seen a lot of people get on the other side of divorce, and the last thing they ever think about is I need to update my beneficiaries. So they might have been rewarded a retirement account like we were talking about just a moment ago. So that could be an IRA or a 401k or something like that. And each of those accounts, much like a life insurance policy, not only you should designate beneficiaries, which says where do these dollars go in the event of my death. And so it's important to do that, but it's also super important to update those in the wake of divorce to make sure that you have those assets going to the people and in the amounts that you want them to go to.
Right.
There's a couple of details around beneficiaries, but the bottom line is you always want to, with the exception of some very rare circumstances, you always want to name an individual living person as a beneficiary. It's rarely a good idea to put like my estate or to put like your will as a beneficiary, because that can change the structure of the tax benefits of a retirement account. So it's best to leave it to a person with a date of birth. I won't get into the actual inheritance of retirement accounts, but suffice it to say, beneficiary designations they're a part of estate planning. So a lot of people think about estate planning as a will and a power of attorney and a living will or an advance directive and things like that. Well, your beneficiary designations are part of estate planning, and your beneficiary designations actually supersede your will. So if you have a last will and testament, but you have beneficiary designations over here on an IRA, for example, and they're different than your will, let's say, the beneficiary designations will hold. So they actually, those pass outside of whatever your will says. So they're important, something that needs to be looked at, and I would say reviewed on a somewhat regular basis, just to make sure that things are up to date and they reflect your, wishes along the way.
Yeah. Well, and we'll skip to that here now. So estate planning is something that actually I did an episode on about a month or so ago with an estate planning attorney. And, we definitely want to mention that here since we're talking about the silver years. And so the importance of estate planning cannot be underestimated, especially in divorce, because so much is changing during this time of your life. And you really want to be proactive here. I mean, the caution is that if you don't handle this, someone else has to. And, it's much more expensive and much more stressful if someone else has to do your estate planning after your death than if you handle it now as you go through the divorce process. And one thing that was discussed with this attorney is that there are rare cases where one party or the other passes away while the divorce is still in process. It's rare, of course, but it happens. And so she actually advises, even for people that are young, that estate planning be the first step in the divorce process. So that's something to definitely keep in mind. And certainly beneficiaries are a part of that. Insurance is a part of that. Medicare is probably a part of that. And one very little known tip that I will offer here, and I probably will be doing an episode on this sometime in the next few months, is the return of premium policy that you can get as a life insurance policy on any support that is awarded to you during your divorce. And I would imagine that when we're talking about more senior years here, that this would become even more important if you are reliant on that alimony or child support for your daily living, that you get, or at least advocate for yourself to get a life insurance policy on that support, so that if your soon-to-be ex passes away before all of that support is paid out, you will still be able to receive it. And this return of premium policy that I've been told exists is kind of a no-brainer for me. I'm thinking for anyone, because in the end, it's going to cost nothing if it isn't realized, if it isn't needed. All of the premium is going to go back to the payer if the policy is not utilized during its term. So I don't know. Have you heard of that type of policy? Have you worked with anybody that's negotiated for such a thing during their divorce?
I haven't. I've heard the term. I'm not familiar with it, so I don't sell life insurance.
Okay.
I do a lot of planning around insurance to make sure people have enough. But as far as actually putting it in place, I usually refer that out to other professionals.
Okay.
In my experience, I do agree. I think that if there is an ongoing stream of income, whether that's spousal support or even child support, it's smart, assuming you can afford to, it's smart to insure that. Mm-hmm. Typically what I see is people just buy cheap term insurance. Mm-hmm. So you do lose the premiums if it's not used. And so a potential for a return of premium policy is intriguing, but I just, frankly, I don't know enough about it to speak with any authority.
Right. And we're not going to get into that, but that's just something I wanted to mention because it lines up with what we're talking about here and the importance of making sure that your estate in all facets is addressed during this silver divorce process. So I think other than complicated and complex marital estates, we've kind of covered everything. What thoughts should we relate to people here about, when your estate is very complex? Now, maybe that is large numbers of retirement accounts or other non-retirement assets. Maybe that's you own hundreds of rental properties. Maybe that's, I don't know, other thoughts come to your mind at all on this?
Yeah. So most often in my experience, complex is often associated with higher dollar figures. It's typically associated with high net worth or ultra high net worth. But that's not always the case. It can be, if you're in a second or even a third marriage and you're going through divorce and you've got kids from multiple marriages, or your spouse has kids from prior marriages and things like that, that can add different layers of complexity to the decision-making process in the divorce, as well as the estate planning. And you want to make sure that if something were to happen to you, that you want to make sure you take care of your kids. And you may or may not want to have part of your asset to go to, stepchildren or, your ex's, kids, things like that. So that's a pretty sticky subject and needs to be, addressed thoughtfully and carefully. I think the best thing you can do in that situation, though, is just have your professionals talking to each other. So if you work with an estate planning attorney, make sure that they're in communication with your family law attorney. If you've got a financial planner or a financial advisor or even an insurance agent or a realtor, make sure that they're talking early and often, because there are some things that you can do before the divorce is finalized that will make your life much, much easier once the ink is dry on the settlement agreement. So I think the best thing you can do is, if you do work with one or more professionals, is think of them as your team and have them all working for you on your behalf. Yeah,
I agree. And another sticky subject that we won't spend any time on, but we'll mention it, is remarriage. Sometimes very quickly after the divorce. Prenups and postnups that maybe need to be considered as part of that, especially in regard to complicated and complex estate division.
Yeah. And interestingly, I was reading an article, and I've actually heard this phrase before, but I've heard older women especially, cautioned about remarriage later in life, because certainly this is not all men, but a lot of men are looking for a purse or a nurse. So they're looking for someone to either take care of them physically and or financially. And so if you do come out of your own divorce and you're in an average or above average financial situation, be cautious. And, whether we're talking about a prenup, a postnup, or something like that, just be cautious.
Yeah. It may not be romantic, but it's important. Yeah. So, okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing your financial expertise with us today. What final thoughts would you like to leave listeners with on silver divorce?
The one final thing I would add, Annie, is that, at the end of the day, whether you go through divorce late in life or not, we all get one shot at our lives. And it's up to each of us to make the most of the one life we get. And so whether that's staying in a relationship or leaving a relationship, regardless of the circumstances, focus on what's important to you and your values, because it's so easy for us to be influenced by friends and well-meaning friends and family, because we oftentimes put a burden on ourselves that we need to live up to their expectations, or we have relationships that we want to maintain. And so not only are we often fearful of change for ourselves, but we're also fearful of changing relationships. And what if I do something different? Or what if I become a different person? How is that going to impact my relationship with my former in-laws or my adult children, or whatever the case may be? And at the end of the day, you've got to live your life for you. And I'm not saying there won't be some tough decisions to be made along the way, but I would just, don't be afraid to be a little bit selfish, especially when it comes to the divorce process, and especially even more so when it's later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. Great caution. And I will just say, we've spent a lot of time in our left brains here today. So just, you've kind of begun to make that transition here, and I'm going to do the same. Silver divorce is harder than other, divorces. And that goes for both parties, and that goes for their children. And so I think it's an especially important caution and just word of encouragement to those listening that you need to be good to you. You need to be good to yourself. You need to communicate well and, do everything you can to ease everyone through this, and just be aware that, you would think maybe that it would be easier because you're older and you're wiser and your kids are older and wiser, but you also have more years invested in this space of, this is who we are as a family, and that's all changing. And the longer that our kids, especially, and us, have had to get used to a situation and that be our normal, the harder it is to change that. So I think it's very wise to breathe deeper and really, truly just be good to you, and be patient with everyone, as this is certainly the harder of the divorces, when it comes to just the amount of time invested in it, and time is money, and time is energy, and time is emotion, right? So it's going to be hard, but that doesn't mean that you can't come out on the other side of it better than you ever imagined, and you absolutely can. So hopefully, with paying attention to the things that we've brought to mind today, you will be that much closer to finding that new fresh start that you're looking for through this time.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you.
I've enjoyed the conversation, Annie, and I hope your listeners have gotten some good takeaways or things to think about after listening to it.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. And I hope they took good notes. If not, they need to go back and listen again because there was a lot here. So thank you again for what you've shared with us. And listeners, thank you for tuning in again this week to explore this topic with us. And certainly no matter what age you are at, there are topics here that you probably want to explore as you go through your divorce. So thank you for tuning in. And we will see you again next week for more help as you divorce, and hope as you are starting over stronger.